My mother attempted to sabotage my wedding and tried to turn my fiancé against me. After I finally left the house, she begged me for forgiveness, but by then it was too late. My wedding is only a month away, and things have taken an unexpected, unsettling turn that I never could have predicted. I'm Jessica, 28, and for most of my life I believed my mom, Elaine, and I were close, or at least I thought so. Our relationship shifted dramatically after my mom recently remarried. Daniel, her new husband, is decent enough, I suppose, but he could never replace my dad, Peter. For context, my parents separated when I was 16. It was a rough time, but my dad and I stayed close. My mom, on the other hand, still harbors a lot of resentment toward him. In some ways, I think her marriage to Daniel was not only her way of moving on, but also a subtle way of getting back at my dad. I was genuinely happy for her until she brought up a very disturbing idea related to my wedding. A few weeks ago, we were sitting in the living room of the house where I grew up. The day was warm and sunny, and the room held countless memories of family Christmases, birthdays, and all the things that make a place feel like home. Out of nowhere, my mom said, "Jessica, I think Daniel should be the one to walk you down the aisle." I was so stunned I nearly dropped my coffee. I thought at first she was kidding, but no, she was completely serious. I immediately said, "No, Mom, Dad is walking me down the aisle. That's not even up for discussion," but she wouldn't let it go. "Your father abandoned us, Jessica," she said, looking at me as though I were betraying her by even considering my dad for the role. "He was never there for you or for me. Daniel is your stepfather, now he's the one who should be giving you away." I felt my face getting hot with anger. Dad didn't abandon us. Yes, he moved out, but he was always around when I needed him. He wasn't perfect, but he was there, I told her. I want Dad to be a part of this. He's my father, and you can't just erase him from my life. Her face grew cold, and although I'd seen my mom mad before, this felt different. It was like she was trying to use guilt to manipulate me. "After everything I've done for you," she started, her voice sharp, "you're still choosing him over me. Do you know how much that hurts, Jessica?" I was completely taken aback. How was any of this even about her? I explained that this wasn't a competition. I wasn't excluding her, I just wanted my dad to have a role. But she wouldn't let it drop. She insisted that Daniel had stepped into our lives when Dad left and that I should appreciate having someone like him around. At this point, I was practically shaking. I'd always respected my mom's opinions, but this was my wedding, my choice. I'd made up my mind. I stood up, looked her straight in the eye, and said, "Dad will walk me down the aisle. That's final." I walked out of the room, leaving her there, clearly fuming. For a while, I thought that would be the end of it. I figured she'd eventually cool off and realize how unreasonable she was being. But the very next day, she brought it up again. "Jessica, do you want to ruin my marriage? Daniel is hurt by your decision. This wedding is supposed to bring the family together, and you're tearing us apart," she said, arguing that Daniel deserved to feel included because he was now part of our family. I understood her desire to include Daniel, but he'd been in my life for only 2 years. I'd known my dad my entire life. I tried explaining this to her, but she just kept pushing, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful. It became a constant battle. Every time we talked, she'd find a way to bring it up, trying to wear me down, hoping I'd eventually give in. Each time, I told her no, and each time, she got a little more irritated. The worst part was when she began saying things like, "Do you even care about me, Jessica? After everything I've sacrificed for you, this is how you repay me." It felt like emotional manipulation, and it hurt, but at the same time, it only pushed me further away from her. I thought about just giving in to keep the peace, but I knew that if I did, it would eat me up inside. I had already agreed to let Daniel be in some of the family photos, but I wasn't going to compromise on the walk down the aisle. That moment was for my dad, and I wouldn't let anyone take it from him. After that intense argument with my mom over who would walk me down the aisle, I thought things might calm down. I was wrong. Instead of backing off, my mom seemed more determined than ever to interfere with my wedding plans. It was as if she was set on destroying everything. At first, it started with small, seemingly innocent mishaps. For instance, some of the invitations I had printed went missing shortly after I'd finished them. Initially, I thought I might have miscounted, but the next morning I found them in the trash in the kitchen. When I confronted Mom about it, she acted surprised, saying, "Oh, honey, I must have thought they were scrap paper, but they were still in their envelopes, with postage and everything." Then she began meddling with my appointments. I'd scheduled a meeting with the florist, but when I arrived, they informed me that my appointment had been canceled. Since I knew I hadn't canceled it, I asked who had. They told me a woman who identified herself as my mother had done it. I was beyond embarrassed and frustrated, having to reschedule and falling behind on my planning. When I got home, I confronted her again. "Mom, did you cancel my florist appointment?" She didn't even bother to deny it. She simply shrugged and said, "I thought you were spending too much on flowers, Jessica. Weddings shouldn't be about material things." I was livid. I had been saving for this wedding for 2 years, cutting back on nights out, skipping vacations, and working extra shifts to afford everything I wanted. Now, she was acting as if I were being irresponsible. I told her it wasn't her decision to make, and she rolled her eyes at me as if I were a rebellious teenager. Then things took an even darker turn. A week later, I found out she'd gone behind my back to try to change the wedding venue. I'd chosen a beautiful garden space filled with flowers, lots of open air, a perfect blend of natural beauty and elegance. I imagined walking down a rose-lined path, surrounded by loved ones, with my dad by my side. Well, apparently my mom had called the venue and tried to switch it to a community hall in town. I was shocked when the venue manager called to confirm the change request. When I told them I hadn't made any changes, they informed me that someone claiming to be my mother had made the request on my behalf. I knew right away it was her. I called my mom, barely letting her greet me before I confronted her. "Why are you sabotaging my wedding, Mom? This isn't your wedding, it's mine, and I'm tired of you trying to ruin it." She tried to play innocent at first, but when I mentioned the venue, she just laughed and said, "Jessica, that garden is far too expensive. A community hall is much more sensible," as if she were doing me a favor. I was in disbelief at her nerve. I told her I'd rather cancel the entire wedding than let her make any more changes. She didn't seem to care, only continuing to call me ungrateful and insisting that Daniel was disappointed I was excluding him from my life. At that moment, I was ready to burst. I started shouting, which I almost never do, telling her that this wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but she was turning it into a nightmare. I expressed my frustration with her making everything about Daniel and her new marriage, and I couldn't believe she'd go so far as to ruin my wedding just to make a point about him. She brushed it off, saying I was overreacting, acting dramatic, but I could see in her face that she was enjoying every second of it. I realized then that this wasn't just about who would walk me down the aisle, this was about control. She wanted to be the one making all the decisions and was willing to go to extreme lengths to get her way. After that conversation, I took steps to regain control. I changed all my passwords, added confirmation pins to every wedding-related appointment, and made sure I was the only one authorized to make changes. I even informed the venue and vendors to ignore any calls from her. They were understanding, especially after I explained the situation. But despite these measures, the sabotage didn't stop. About a week later, I found out she'd started reaching out to my fiancé, Liam. I suppose she thought that if she couldn't get to me directly, she'd try influencing him. She invited him over for coffee and spent the entire time expressing her concerns about me, making it seem like I was unstable and needed someone to talk sense into me. Thankfully, Liam knows me well enough to see through her manipulation. He told me everything when he got home, and I felt a mix of relief and anger. I was grateful he hadn't fallen for her tactics, but I was also furious that she was trying to undermine me with my own fiancé. That conversation with Liam marked a turning point for me. I realized that my mom's interference was starting to affect more than just me. It was seeping into my relationship with the man I was about to marry. I couldn't let that happen. I decided that I wouldn't allow her to ruin this for us. I went over to her house, determined to have one final decisive confrontation. I told her plainly that she was no longer welcome at my wedding. If she couldn't respect my boundaries and choices, then she didn't belong there. She just laughed, looking at me with a smug expression that made my skin crawl. "You'll come crawling back," she sneered, as if she didn't believe I'd actually go through with it. "You always do. I'm your mother, Jessica. You need me more than you realize." I walked out feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. It hurt that things had come to this, but at the same time, I felt like a huge burden had been lifted. I was finally standing up for myself, and it felt liberating. Since then, she's been sending guilt-tripping texts, but I haven't replied. I know she'll probably keep finding ways to try and interfere, but for the first time I feel like I'm in control of my life again. It's disheartening to think that I might need to cut her out completely, but if that's what it takes to protect my happiness, then so be it. After deciding to exclude my mom from the wedding, I hoped things would calm down. I was wrong. The week following that confrontation was filled with stress and uncertainty. Mom began spreading rumors among family and friends, portraying me as ungrateful and rebellious. Soon I was receiving passive-aggressive messages from aunts, cousins, and even some of her friends, all subtly pressuring me to forgive her and let her be part of the wedding. It was exhausting. One evening, after a long day of tying up loose ends for the wedding, I came home to find my phone flooded with messages from my mom. I'd considered blocking her number but decided against it in case of emergencies, a decision I was starting to regret. Her texts came in rapid succession, as though I was expected to respond to her every whim. The main message was clear: she was furious that I'd dared to cut her out, and she launched into a tirade about how I'd regret this for the rest of my life. It was typical guilt-tripping, but it still stung. I decided it was time to move in with my dad temporarily. Liam was okay with it, even if it meant some added chaos right before the wedding. So I packed up my things, called Dad, and he didn't hesitate to welcome me. When I arrived, it felt like coming up for air after being underwater for too long. He hugged me and said, "You don't have to worry about her here." Those words were like a balm. I felt a calmness I hadn't experienced in months. Over the next few days, Dad and I talked a lot about everything from the wedding to memories of his time with Mom. He shared things I hadn't known, like how she'd always been possessive and, at times, even manipulative, even during their dating years. It was eye-opening. I'd always seen my mom as strict but fair. Now I realized there had been a darker side to her all along. We spent time reminiscing about old memories and looking through photos. It felt good to be around someone who genuinely understood me without any hidden agenda. I started feeling more grounded, more certain that keeping Mom away was the right decision. But just when I thought I'd finally found peace, she showed up at Dad's house. I had stepped out to pick up some groceries, and when I returned, there she was, sitting in the living room with Dad, looking every bit the picture of righteous indignation. She fixed me with a smug look, as if she'd won some twisted game. Dad looked uncomfortable but didn't want to escalate the situation. She immediately started in on me. "Jessica, what do you think you're doing, running to your father?" Of all people, she snapped, her tone as though I were a child being scolded. "He's just filling your head with lies." I was too stunned to respond for a moment. I hadn't anticipated her showing up here, of all places. But then it struck me she was desperate, clinging to this power struggle she was determined to win. I steadied myself and found my voice. "Mom, you can't keep doing this. You're making it about you, and it's not. This is my wedding and I want you to leave." I kept my tone firm, even though my hands were shaking, hoping she'd understand that I was serious. She looked at Dad, probably hoping he'd back her up, but he simply shook his head and said, "Elaine, you should go. That set her off even more." She turned on him, bringing up old arguments from their marriage and accusing him of turning me against her. After her dramatic exit from Dad's house, I thought I'd finally seen the last of her antics. The relief felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. With just a few days left until the wedding, I was determined to focus on the positives. I had Liam, my dad, and a close group of friends who were thrilled for me. I was ready to close this painful chapter with my mom and move on. The wedding day arrived, and it was perfect. The garden venue looked even more beautiful than I'd imagined, with soft sunlight filtering through the trees and casting a warm glow over everything. Dad was by my side, just as I'd always wanted, and he looked so proud as he walked me down the aisle. I could feel the love and support from everyone around us, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was truly happy. Liam was waiting at the altar, beaming, and as we exchanged our vows, all the stress and tension from the past few months melted away. In that moment, it was just the two of us, pledging to love and support each other through anything. It felt completely right, like the start of something beautiful and full of hope. We shared our first kiss as husband and wife, and the cheers from our family and friends brought me back to reality. It was done. I was married at last, and nothing my mother had done could take that away from me. The reception was equally enchanting. I danced with Dad, laughed with my friends, and experienced a peace I hadn't felt in years. But I hadn't realized how much of my life had been overshadowed by my mother's constant influence until it was finally gone. It felt freeing, like I could finally be myself without fearing her reactions or interference. Liam and I left the reception feeling elated, as if we'd survived a storm and emerged stronger on the other side. A few weeks later, as we settled into married life, I thought the drama was behind me. But then, one afternoon, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, but eventually answered, and the moment I heard the voice on the other end, my heart sank. It was my mother. "Jessica." "It's me," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to see you." I need to talk." She sounded different, almost vulnerable, and despite everything that had happened, I felt a pang of concern. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a cafe downtown. I was anxious and didn't know what to expect, but I felt a need for closure. When I arrived, she was already there, looking surprisingly tired and worn. The fire that usually drove her seemed extinguished. She glanced up as I approached, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the mom I used to know from before everything fell apart. We sat in silence for a few moments before she finally spoke. "Jessica, I'm sorry," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I've done things that hurt you, and I'm ashamed of how I handled everything. I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I see now that I was wrong." I listened, feeling a whirlwind of emotions, anger mixed with a strange sense of relief. This was the apology I'd wanted for so long, yet hearing it now, I wasn't sure how to respond. She continued, explaining that she had been struggling with issues with Daniel and that things weren't as perfect as she had made them seem. She admitted that her unresolved feelings about Dad had clouded her judgment, and she had projected her feelings onto me. "I guess I was scared, Jess," she said, looking down at her hands. "I was afraid of losing you, afraid of being alone. Things with Daniel, they're not going well, and I think I was clinging to you to fill that emptiness. I didn't realize how much I was hurting you in the process." It was a lot to absorb. I sat there, processing everything. For so long, I'd wanted her to acknowledge the hurt she'd caused, to admit she'd been wrong. Now that she was, I didn't know what to say. I could see she was genuinely remorseful, but I couldn't ignore the pain she'd caused. I took a deep breath and finally responded. "Mom, I appreciate your apology, but I can't just forget what happened. These past months were awful for me, and it'll take time to heal. I need space, and I need you to respect that." She nodded, her eyes filled with tears, and I could tell my words had struck her deeply. She reached across the table, gently squeezing my hand. "I understand, Jessica. I'll give you the space you need. I just want you to know that I love you, and I'm here if you ever want to talk." I left the cafe with a strange sense of closure. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was an ending. I knew my relationship with my mom would never be the same, but at least I could move forward, knowing I'd finally stood up for myself and set boundaries. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my life and ready to focus on my future with Liam. After that final meeting with my mom, I truly thought I was ready to move on. I started settling into my new life with Liam, savoring the routines we were building together. Our weekends were filled with lazy breakfasts, long walks, and day trips to nearby towns. I loved the simplicity and peace, the sense that everything was finally falling into place. But as life often has it, just when you think you've left your troubles behind, they find a way of creeping back in. About a month after my conversation with Mom at the cafe, Liam and I had an unexpected visitor. It was a Saturday morning and we were relaxing, planning our day, when a knock sounded at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Liam looked at me curiously before going to answer it. I followed, my curiosity piqued, but nothing could have prepared me for the person standing on the other side, Daniel. He looked entirely different from the last time I'd seen him. The usually confident and polished man now looked disheveled, with wrinkled clothes, messy hair, and dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. My stomach dropped. What was he doing here? "Jessica," he said, his voice strained. "I know this is unexpected, but I really need to talk to you." I glanced at Liam, who gave me a reassuring nod and then stepped aside to let Daniel in. We led him to the living room, where he took a seat on the couch, running a hand over his face as if trying to collect himself. An uncomfortable silence filled the room before he finally looked up. "Jessica, I know things between us have never been great," he began, "and I'm not here to cause trouble. I need to clear the air about a few things, for your sake and for mine." I crossed my arms, trying to appear calm, though my heart was pounding. Daniel was the last person I expected to see, and I had no idea what he was about to reveal, but his expression was raw, so unlike the usual confidence he exuded, that I found myself willing to hear him out. Taking a deep breath, he started to speak. "Your mother and I, things between us have been difficult. I know you're probably aware of that by now, but there's more to it than you realize. I never planned to tell anyone this because I didn't think it would ever matter, but now, after everything that's happened, I feel like you deserve to know the truth." The truth? My mind was racing, wondering what he could mean. Was this about their relationship? Did it have something to do with their separation? Daniel continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Jessica, your mother. "She never got over your father," he said quietly. "She used to talk about him all the time, even when we were first together. At first I thought it was just part of her healing process, but as time went on, it became obvious that she wasn't letting go. She clung to this lingering resentment, and it started to consume her. I tried to help, but nothing I did ever seemed to measure up to him. The weight of his words settled heavily in the room, drawing our full attention. I'd known my mom had issues with Dad, but I hadn't realized how deeply it had affected her new marriage. As Daniel spoke, I felt a strange blend of sympathy and frustration. I could see that he was in pain, but he wasn't innocent in all this. He had allowed himself to become part of her manipulation, and now he was here looking for some form of absolution. He continued, "When your mom asked me to walk you down the aisle, I knew it wasn't right, that it wasn't my role. But I also knew how much it mattered to her. She convinced herself that it would be a way to rewrite history, to fix something she felt was broken. She thought that if she could control this one thing, it would somehow make up for all the years she felt abandoned by your father." I shook my head, trying to make sense of everything he was saying. It all felt surreal, as if I were watching someone else's life come undone. But this was my life, my family, and these were the people who had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. Liam reached over and took my hand, grounding me. His presence reminded me that I wasn't alone in this, that I had someone who loved me and would stand by me through everything. I squeezed his hand, drawing strength from him as I prepared for whatever Daniel was about to say next. "There's more," Jessica Daniel said, averting his gaze as though he couldn't bear to look me in the eyes. "Your mom. She made me do things I'm not proud of. When you started planning your wedding, she pressured me to meddle, to make sure everything went her way. She wanted to control every detail, not because it was about you, but because she wanted to feel powerful. And I went along with it, thinking it would make her happy, but instead it only drove us further apart." A surge of anger rose in me, but this time it wasn't directed at Daniel, it was at my mother. For so long I had blamed him, seeing him as the villain in all of this, but now I could see that he, too, had been manipulated, much like I had been. He wasn't innocent, but he also wasn't the monster I'd made him out to be. "What do you want from me, Daniel?" I finally asked, my voice trembling. "Why are you telling me all this now?" He lifted his head, regret evident in his eyes. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "Maybe I just needed to get it off my chest, or maybe I hoped you'd understand that I never intended to hurt you. I know I can't change the past, but I wanted you to know the truth. For whatever it's worth, I'm sorry." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself as a storm of emotions surged within: anger, sadness, betrayal, but also a strange sense of relief. Daniel's confession, as painful as it was, offered me a new perspective. I could see now that he wasn't the root of my problems, he was simply another victim of my mother's manipulations. "Thank you for telling me," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do with all of this right now, but I appreciate your honesty." He nodded, and for a moment we sat there in silence. It was a heavy silence, filled with unspoken words, but it was also one of understanding. I didn't fully forgive him, but I did understand him a bit more, and that felt like a step forward. After Daniel left, Liam held me close as we processed everything that had just happened. In his arms I felt a rare calm. I had been through so much, but I was still here, still standing. I had faced the truth, painful as it was, and emerged stronger for it. But as the days went by, I began to notice something unsettling. My mother wasn't just avoiding me, she seemed to have disappeared entirely. There were no messages, no phone calls, nothing. I reached out to a few family members, but no one had heard from her. It was as if she had vanished without a trace. One evening, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was a private investigator who informed me that my mother had hired him to dig into my life, trying to find anything she could use to control me further. I was shocked she had gone so far down the rabbit hole that she'd stooped to spying on her own daughter just to hold on to power. The investigator apologized, explaining that he hadn't realized how obsessive she was until it was too late. Once he saw the full extent of her behavior, he stopped working for her, but he felt it was important to let me know. I was horrified, but I also felt a strange sense of validation. Now I had undeniable proof that cutting her out of my life had been the right choice. A month later, I received a letter from a law firm. Curious and a bit apprehensive, I set up a meeting with the attorney. Though my mother had requested I come alone, I decided to bring Liam for support. I didn't want to face whatever she had planned without him, and he readily agreed to join me. We entered the dimly lit office, where a receptionist led us to a spacious meeting room. My mother was already seated at the long, polished table, her posture tense and her expression guarded. "Jessica, thank you for coming," she said, giving me a curt nod. She briefly glanced at Liam but didn't directly acknowledge him. The attorney, Mr. Thompson, entered and gestured for us to take our seats. Without delay, he began the formalities. "Mrs. Elaine Walker has requested this meeting to discuss her estate planning," he said, handing me a thick file of documents. "Before we proceed, there are personal matters Mrs. Walker would like to address with you, Jessica." I opened the file and skimmed the pages. The estate details were straightforward. My mother was leaving most of her assets to me, along with a few charitable donations. There were restrictions on the family home which couldn't be sold but could be rented out, as well as a trust fund with various stipulations that would require my signature. "Jessica, I don't expect you to be pleased by this," Elaine said, watching me closely as I reviewed the documents, "but I wanted you to understand my intentions." I looked up, meeting her gaze directly. And what exactly are those intentions? My tone was colder than I intended, but the tension in the room was stifling. Elaine didn't flinch. "These terms reflect my final wishes," she replied steadily. "I don't expect you to agree with them, but I need you to know why I made these choices." She took out a slim envelope and slid it across the table. "Read this when you're ready. It might give you some insight." I picked up the envelope, but instead of opening it, I set it aside and returned to the documents, flipping through them until I felt I understood the basics. I nodded at Mr. Thompson, indicating I was ready, and he began explaining the details. He outlined the trust's terms, mentioning that it would cover maintenance or repairs for the family home but had strict limitations on its use. Elaine sat silently through the explanation, her gaze occasionally drifting to the window. When Mr. Thompson finished, my mother cleared her throat. "That's all I wanted to say. I know this isn't the outcome you hoped for, but it's what I believe is right." Without waiting for a reply, she stood and left, leaving Liam and me with Mr. Thompson. He handed over a set of documents for my signature, which I signed quickly before Liam and I walked outside, the envelope still clutched in my hand. We didn't open it then, and we drove home in silence. 2 days later, my Aunt Susan called, her voice barely controlled as she shared the news. "Jessica, it's your mother... She passed last night. It was sudden, a heart attack." The words felt like a blow, but there was no time to process. Arrangements had to be made, and Aunt Susan was relying on me to help. I agreed, still holding the unopened envelope from Elaine. It felt even heavier now. I slipped it into my coat pocket as Liam and I hurried to the family home, where Aunt Susan and a few relatives had gathered. The funeral came together quickly, small and understated, just as Elaine would have wanted. I managed the arrangements with Susan, choosing a simple casket and modest floral arrangements. The service was held in a quiet chapel, attended by a few close family members and her friends. Liam stayed beside me the entire time, offering steady support in the somber setting. After the service, everyone returned to the family home. Susan had invited people to gather there, and soon the house filled with soft murmurs and the clinking of cups as people paid their respects. As I drifted through the rooms, accepting condolences and thanking guests for coming, the whole scene felt surreal. People I hadn't seen in years, now here to say goodbye. Liam eventually found me and gently pulled me aside. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, and he slipped his arm around me, guiding me to a quieter corner. We were watching the small crowd when Susan approached. "Jessica, there's something you should see," she said, motioning for us to follow her upstairs. I glanced at Liam, who nodded, and together we went to Elaine's bedroom. Susan opened a small drawer in the nightstand and took out a worn, leather-bound journal. "Your mother wrote in this daily," she said, handing it to me. "I think she'd want you to have it." I accepted the journal, placing it in my bag, deciding I'd read it later. As we returned downstairs, I noticed Daniel had arrived. He was standing in the hallway, looking unsure, with his hands shoved into his pockets. When he saw us, his expression shifted, a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite read. "Jessica," he greeted me with a small nod. I wasn't sure if I should come, but I needed to say goodbye too. I nodded. "Thank you for coming, Daniel." The words felt odd, but I meant them. Despite everything, he'd been part of her life, and she had cared about him in her way. He lingered for a moment before speaking again. "Elaine and I had our differences, but she was ... unique. Stubborn as they come, but she could really get under your skin." He managed a small, sad smile before moving to join the other guests. The day wore on, and gradually people began to leave. As the house emptied, Liam and I started to clean up, gathering cups and plates. It was a quiet, almost meditative process, and as we worked, I found myself thinking about the letter. Once we had finished tidying, I decided it was finally time to read it. I sat on the sofa, the envelope still in my hand. Liam sat beside me as I unfolded the paper. Elaine's handwriting, neat and familiar, filled the page. Jessica, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I know I wasn't the mother you needed and I can't change that. But please know that I loved you in the only way I knew how. I hope you find peace, and maybe someday forgiveness. Take care of the house. It's yours now. Love, Mom. I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. Liam reached over, taking my hand and gently brushing his thumb across my knuckles. We sat in silence, the letter between us, a quiet testament to everything that had happened. The following day, Liam and I returned to the family home to start sorting through Elaine's belongings. We chose to begin with the attic, hoping to tackle the most daunting part first. Climbing the narrow stairs, we entered the attic, where dust particles floated in the beams of sunlight streaming through the small windows. It felt like stepping back in time, with old trunks and boxes piled around the room. We opened the first trunk and found a collection of photo albums and mementos from my childhood. I picked up a framed photo of me as a toddler on Elaine's lap, both of us smiling at the camera. Liam looked over my shoulder, smiling as he observed the picture. "She looks happy here," he remarked. I nodded and set the photo aside. We continued going through the trunk, uncovering more photos, birthday cards, and even some of my childhood toys. The next box contained letters, some addressed to my dad and others to friends and family members. One envelope bore my name, written in Elaine's familiar handwriting. I opened it and found a stack of letters she had written to me over the years but had never sent. They were filled with advice, anecdotes, and little notes about her hopes for me. I handed a few to Liam, and together we read them in silence, each letter revealing a side of my mother I'd struggled to understand. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe to hear new stories every day. Let us know in the comments what you liked most.